experiences when she travels back in time. And she gets to see the way all the people who live on her street have come to Canada. Whether they came as a very First Nation, whether they came, she meets a sort of cousin whose name is Fiona, who has come, her grandmother came on what is known as a coffin ship because of the Irish potato famine. So in Ireland, the common crop that most farmers would eat during the 19th century, the middle of the 19th century, was potatoes. And one year, the potatoes began to fail. And when people would eat 8 to 10 pounds of potatoes a person a day, that's what people ate, their most common food. When that food source began to fail, people got very hungry and they had to leave Ireland. Many people died of starvation. And so rather than dying of starvation or eating the grass at the side of the roads, they would find people with their mouths stained green from the grass. You know what happens to a human being if you eat grass? What happens? What do you think happens if you eat grass? You think that you grow strong and healthy? Yeah?
Turn green.
Pardon?
Turn green.
Well, your mouth turns green, for sure. For sure. What happens when you eat grass if you're a cow is that you eat it and then you burp, and the grass comes back up into your mouth and you chew it some more, and you swallow it down again, and you burp, and you chew it some more, and by the time you are done, because you are a cow and you have 4 chambers in your stomach, you can digest the grass, which is made out of cellulose. You are able to get the food material, the value, out of the grass. But if you are a human being and you have a stomach that has only 1 chamber, you eat grass and you get no nutrition and you die of starvation. And so this is what happened to people. And so instead, they got onto ships to come to Canada. And people offered them, this was before Canada was even a country, but there was an opportunity to come here. It was called British North America at the time, and people would come on the coffin ships and they would come to Canada. Now, why would they call it a coffin ship? Why do you think?
Because lots of people died on it from this disease, so
Yeah.
they had to put it.
Yeah, do you know what the disease was? Do you remember?
Something that was in the tea.
Well, so maybe typhoid? Yeah, so that was one disease. Scurvy. Scurvy is a really bad disease that you get if you don't get enough vitamin C. You know what happens if you have scurvy? First, your gums get really sore, and then your teeth all fall out one at a time. Plop, 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 plop. And your bones get really soft. You get a disease called rickets, and you die. And that's from not eating enough vitamin C. That happens on shipboard, but that wasn't what killed most of the people. Tuberculosis, that's another disease that starts with T, and that's a disease that goes into your lungs. In the time of the Irish potato famine, people died of tuberculosis all the time. In those days, it was called consumption. So if you ever read an old book by Jane Austen and somebody's dying of consumption, then that is what tuberculosis is. And as a matter of fact, Jane Austen herself, the author, died of consumption. Yes. Typhus. So typhus and typhoid are 2 varieties of waterborne diseases. So you're on board a ship, and there's not very much fresh water, and so you can get those diseases. The big bad disease during the Irish potato famine, when people were on board ships, the big bad disease that they were afraid of is something that most of you have had a version of. How many people in this room have had chicken pox? Okay, how many people have had the shot so that they don't get chicken pox? Yeah, so I figured when I do this talk in 5 years, I'm going to ask people to put up their hand, and nobody will have had chicken pox except the old people like me. So chicken pox is an awful disease. You know, it's when you get the spots all over your body and they're so itchy and you're not allowed to scratch and you have to play dot to dot with calamine lotion on your face and that sort of thing. Well, chicken pox is a very, very mild version of a disease that existed in the Middle Ages and doesn't exist so much anymore these days. You want to give a shot at it? Smallpox. Okay, so smallpox is actually more closely related to a disease called cowpox, and this is how they figured out how to get rid of this disease. But smallpox was a terrible disease, and when people were forced to live in very close quarters, it was something that passed very rapidly between people. And smallpox, if you managed to survive smallpox, you would be terribly scarred. Your face, your back, your shoulders, your chest would have big, giant, huge pock holes in it, big dips in your skin. And it was a very awful and a terrible disease at the time. Usually, when you got smallpox, your temperature went up really high. So you got very, very hot, and you got such a high fever, most people couldn't even survive the fever. It was a terrible disease, and people were very frightened of it. And if it got on board ship, then people would die because they were in such close quarters and they didn't have healthy food to eat. And so often these ships were known as the coffin ships. So there is a smallpox story in this book. Also, there is the story of my own family coming to North America in this book, which I thought was a pretty interesting story, because my family, my six times great-grandfather, came from Inverness in Scotland with his whole family in the middle of the 1800s, and they took the ship ride, which sometimes could take, if you were really lucky, it could take 6 weeks, 2 months. If you weren't lucky, if the winds were bad, it could take up to 6 months to get across the ocean. So they would take this long, long journey on the ship, and he got to North America with his family, and they stood out on the dock and they looked down at Prince Edward Island, which is why this story is set in PEI, and they looked down at the dock in Charlottetown, and his wife took one look at it and refused to get off the ship. And so she took her 3 youngest children, and she sailed back to Inverness, and she never saw my grandfather again. And so that is how my family came to North America. I thought it was kind of an interesting story. When she died, her children moved across and to join their father, and have been in Canada ever since. So everybody has a different story. I'd like you to think about what your story is, how your family came to live in Canada, what your family had to give up in order to come and live here. We kind of take for granted living life in Canada and the world that we live in. It's kind of a place that we think is a pretty good place to live. But until you realize how hard some people fought to get here, then I think it gives you a chance to think a little bit more positively about the country that you live in. So these stories are about how different families came to Canada, and they tell the story based on a kid who lives in the country, in the world today. So a kid just like you. So I wanted a chance for kids just like you to find out what life was like back then. So now I think we've got about 5 more minutes so that we can take a few questions. There were lots of questions still at the beginning. So we've got an opportunity, and then if there's time at the end, I might give you a little taste of the next book in the Darby series, which is called Facing Fire. Okay, so any thoughts? Not one person is asking if I was a pirate. Yes? You know what? For me, it's. I love writing books, and so it's something that's really fun. But they are hard to write because I have to do the research. So different authors have different views on this. Now, I write fiction, right? What does that mean? It means it's not real. It means that I make it up, right? But it's historical fiction. Most of it is historical fiction. And so what I do, and this is really important to me, is that I do a ton of research. When I wrote this book, I went to the archives in Charlottetown, in the library there, and I sat down and I researched who was on these ships. I read the manifests of all the ships of people that came across. I did research into the languages in northern Canada. So there's a lot of work that goes into it before you can write the book. So you have to try and find a balance between the researching until forever and stopping to write the book.